Everyone, and welcome to Committee of the Whole. We have a number of items before us today. We're going to start with 2 updates, and then we have 3 formal resolutions. And then commissioners, just give you a heads up, I'm going to call for executive session. We have 4 items for executive session. 1 right after Cal will be to talk about a legal opinion and legal advice. And then we have our appointed officials' performance reviews. And so I'll call the question. I think I can call them together, and then I'll need a voice vote for that after Cal. And we're going to go down to the attorney's office for the executive session. All right, so first item before us is our wonderful mid-year financial update. So I think all of us have lived through these updates in the past. And so typically it's a mixed bag if you read the report.
It's a dentist appointment or something.
So I'm going to turn it over to our CFO for this first item to walk us through the unaudited financial results and our economic outlook, which is good timing as we tee up for our strategic planning next month, and then as the city manager prepares his budget for next year.
Great.
So, welcome, Jeff.
Well, good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. Yeah, as you said, you have been through this before, so I'll go through rather quickly. Feel free to stop me along the way if you have any questions. Again, these are unaudited results. We do not expect any changes at this point. We did switch to a new auditor this year, so the process took a little longer than usual, but we do expect the final report to be issued within the next couple weeks. So you'll see on the general fund, which is what this update is primarily about, we're projecting to finish $3.4 million revenues over expenditures for FY18, so a very good finish, but within $500,000 of our estimate. So we're very close to our estimate for FY18. We also always look at one-time revenues versus one-time expenses, and we've almost run out of these one-time issues, but when we looked at this analysis this year, you can see we had ongoing, when we took out the COPS grant funding and then the transfer to the budget stabilization fund, our ongoing revenues did exceed expenses by $3.7 million, so that's a good sign. So we always put forth this slide to say what changed since the beginning of the year, and you'll notice, or you'll remember, we had reappropriations of $992,000. Most of that was related to the police and community relations. So when you plug in that carry forward, you'll see we're now projecting our FY19 to finish at $29.9 million, or about $800,000 less than the fiscal plan shows right now. Here is our total unassigned fund balance in both the general fund and the budget stabilization fund. You will note our guidelines are 15% in the general fund and 10% in budget stabilization. You'll see we're 22.5% unassigned at $30.4 million and $14.3 million in budget stabilization, or 10.7%. So, yes, John.
Yeah, is there anything statutorily that, I know we have our targets, is there anything statutorily that prevents us from funding those to higher than 10 and 15?
No. Okay. Well, budget stabilization does have a limit. I believe it's 20%.
Okay.
So there is a limit there, but not in the general fund.
Very good.
This is the fund balance history. You can see since 2010 we've been tracking this. We started funding the budget stabilization in 2012, and we're up to 10.7, as I said, and 22.5 in the general fund. And then the next slide shows the dollar amount history. Still really good results from where we were in 2010. So taxes, how do we do in our primary income, our revenue sources in taxes? You can see we finished in the general fund $81.5 million in income taxes, about $250,000 above what we estimated, so very close to our estimate. And you can see at the bottom we had estimated 4.5% growth, and we actually finished at 4.79. And then you can see property taxes and the admin fees. So overall taxes in the general fund were just over $400,000 above our estimate. Some other larger revenue variances. You can see miscellaneous service fees, and the blue bar is the estimates, red bar is the actuals. So you can see all very close to what we estimated. Intergovernmental, that's primarily made up of revenue sharing and some fire grants. You can see it's $18.7 million, slightly above our estimate, and then other financing sources.
And Jeff, remind me, do you have a breakdown of revenue sharing?
I do, it's coming up, yep.
Okay, thanks.
Some of our other larger categories, licenses and permits, fines and forfeitures, interest and rents, and other revenue. And again, most of those slightly exceeded our estimates. On the revenue side, we did a total departmental variance this time. You can see almost every department finished under their budget other than little community development at 3.9 million, so very, very close. So overall, departments did a really good job sticking within their budgeted expenses for the year.
And Jeff, is that largely because of lapse in salaries or?
It includes lapse, it includes, a lot of contract services don't get fully spent, supplies, those types of things are typically under the estimates, so. We always look at lapse when we build our budgets each year, and this year, if you remember, we upped our lapse to $4 million annually. So we do a comparison over the last several years to make sure that's an appropriate figure to use, and you can see it's averaged just under 4.5 million in lapse in the general fund over the last, 6 years. So we still feel our $4 million number is a good number going forward. So the transformation fund, we'll go over a couple other funds real quickly. So the plan in 18 was to close out the transformation fund, and as you know, we kind of pivoted during the FY19 budget process, and $750,000 now was left in there for third ward investment. You can see in 19 we're going to transfer 4.1 million for river corridor activation, capital reserve fund 572, and then third ward is the 750. So total 19 expenses are estimated at $5.4 million, and that'll leave the 750 in there if none of that is spent this fiscal year. And we're currently working on a plan to use those funds. Vital Streets, it's the third year where we've started collecting the 15-year temporary income tax. You'll note we collected just over $13 million in income tax. When we started the program, it was just over $9 million, so we've had really good income tax growth in this program. Approximately $35 million was spent in 18. However, $17 million of that was to pay back that first installment loan we took out to advance construct some of the work. So one of those is paid off. The second one, balloons, you'll see at the bottom in August of 2020. And then the last one, we did a 10-year equal payment amount on that last bond. So, and you also note the state investment is expected to exceed the $6 million this year for the first time, so we should be achieving actually above the $22 million annual amount required to meet our investment guidelines. So that's good news.
Jeff, can I just ask one question about that, especially in light of the governor's recommendation for funding for infrastructure? Do we have projects teed up and ready to go next year if we have additional funds from the state?
I would have to defer to Rick. I'm not sure he's in the room, but I know his plan is pretty much drawn out for the entire 15-year period. So he could easily move projects ahead if we had to. I have to check if any of those are construction ready at this point, though. So
Okay.
we can get back to you on that. Eric says yes.
Okay. Good.
So more on Vital Streets, we had nearly $1.5 million in state supplemental funding in FY18, and then $2.5 million in 19. We expect to receive, and the ratings were 57.79% good and fair at the end of the 2017 construction season. I understand we just got the new PACER ratings that they're going through right now for FY18, so we'll see how we're doing on that scale. Overall, we've done 283 miles of roads, over 1,300 projects, and spent just under $74 million. So a lot of investment into our street system. So parks, the revenue for the millage was just over $4 million in FY18. The parks GOF support was just under $6 million, which I believe is up about $1 million from where it started when the millage was put in place. They spent about $4.7 million in park investments in FY18, and then 19 will have a similar amount planned. And I like to keep this out in front of you. At the end of the millage, you know, we have some issues in the Parks Fund with the pool support coming off. So you'll see during budget review that the statement doesn't look very good in the out years because of that millage ending. And then planning is currently underway for a renewal request. So FY19 year to date, we have, I know it's early in the year, but we do have some information. So we budgeted state shared revenue of 18.2 million, and the revised estimate we received in July was 18.6, so that's about a $400,000 increase, so that's good news. Property taxes are meeting our forecasts. Personnel, we have continued high retirement rates, as you all know. We continue to work on ways to attract new staff in certain positions like trade skilled or skilled trade positions, and other actually positions and like building inspections and things are really hard to get right now as well. So a lot of our staff are working through temporary services or have done these apprentice positions to try to get people in the door and do our Grow Our Own program. So, and I believe you're aware all of our labor contracts expire June 30 of 19. So those contract negotiations are planning for that is currently underway, and we'll begin with police and fire soon. Capital asset management, we continue to fund all our asset classes. Street lighting was basically the last one that wasn't planned for, and we're expected actually to sell those bonds tomorrow, so we hope for a good sale. And you'll note that the income tax set aside for the capital improvement fund remained at 4.5%. We did reduce that down from 5% in FY17.
Jeff, can I ask for state shared revenue? Can you remind me, was the increase from constitutional?
I don't have the breakdown between that two. It was mostly constitutional, yes. Yep.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Income tax. So this is actually, as you know, our primary revenue stream for the general fund. Year to date, as of the end of October, we were up 9.98%. However, this is extremely volatile in the early part of the year. We typically will get a better feel for where we're going to end up around the January timeframe after we get 6 months in. We did budget a 3% increase in the FY19 fiscal plan. I'm thinking we can up that to probably maybe 4.5%, but I do want to wait another month or so to make that determination. Withholding is up 4.19%. We continue to do a lot of compliance activities that's bringing in additional revenue, and they've done so much with streamlining the processing activities. They have additional time to put towards compliance activities. And we continue to work on easy type forms to make it easier for our taxpayers to file their returns. We've also been utilizing the state tapes in the last few years, which allows us to compare people that file in certain zip codes that are in the city that filed a state return and not a local return. So the economy, go a little bit about a forecast. So the national GDP projection was for a 3% and then a 2.8 and a 1.9, so slightly declining. We also looked at the local Grand Rapids, Wyoming change, and it was 3.3% in 2017. We didn't find any forecasts for just our area. Low unemployment rates, 3.4 nationally, 3.6 in 2020. Our area is 2.6%. I think it's one of the lowest in the nations, actually, so a lot of people are having a difficult time finding good employees. Inflation continues to remain in check. That's what the Fed Reserve looks at a lot of times to say, are we going to raise our interest rates? They're still projected to do another 0.25% increase in December based upon the low inflation. However, tariff wars, as you can see with a lot of our bids that have been coming in high, it's impacting a lot of businesses, and I think it's impacting the way businesses want to invest in their capital. And most economists that I've talked to and read about predict a recession within the next few years. Of course, that's always difficult to predict. The midterm elections didn't have a lot on it for us, but as you all know, the recreational marijuana passed, and we're not exactly sure what that will mean for us revenue-wise. Some people predict some good inflow, but other people predict our costs will actually eat up most of those revenues that we receive. So that's kind of yet to be determined. Property taxes, we still project slow growth on that. We've recovered our SEV, but as you know, the taxable value is limited from Proposal A. And here's the chart you talked about earlier on state shared revenue. You can see at a high, we were about 27 million. We've come back slightly from that to about 22 million, but still not nearly where we were back in 2002. So retiree health care, this is something we like to keep as a close eye on. This is one of our OPEB costs. You can see here we had about $63.4 million in assets in our 3 retiree trusts as of June 30 of 18. Which is really good progress from 0 back in 2007. But you can still see we do have an unfunded liability of $104 million, and we do not have the report yet for 6/30/18, so I'm not exactly sure where that number falls out yet. We should have those shortly. And we've continued to fund the normal cost plus the unfunded portion since 2007. And currently 62% of our employees now are in the RHSA program. Any questions on the Retiree Health Trust?
Commissioner Lenny, questions? Okay.
Pension. So we just received the general pension report as of June 30. The contribution amount went up a little bit, about 1.5 to 34.74%. And most of that increase was due to they lowered the assumption return from 7.25 to 7.15 in both plans. We do blend that with the DC retirement pension. We don't have that report yet, so we're estimating about 23% will be the percent contribution for the general pension system, and police and fire is currently projected at 23.71% of payroll. They're both about funded around 81, 82%, both plans. So not 100% like we'd like to see, but better than a lot of the systems in Michigan and around the country.
Let me see if there's questions or comments. Questions, Commissioner?
So can you, Jeff, remind us where we were just 10 years ago with that fund balance?
So about 10 years ago, but in 2000, the early 2000s, we both plans were overfunded, and the city really wasn't contributing to either pension or OPEB then. And you'll see in a number here coming up what we contribute now versus what we did back then. So as the Great Recession hit, obviously the stock market dropped about 60%, I think, back then. So most plans around the country became underfunded. So, and we've hovered around the 80% ever since.
Oh, so that's pretty standard even
It's,
from
it,
2010?
it's not moved a whole lot since then, yeah.
Low interest rates, okay.
Bless you.
Excuse me, thanks. All right, any other questions or comments?
Just so that I understand this, Jeff, because I'm still trying to learn this whole system. So if you include all of our unfunded liabilities, it's the 104 million plus 100 million and plus 85 million? Is
Correct.
that- Okay.
Yep. Good.
All right, anything else?
So looking ahead, we'd like to, Public Act 202 was passed earlier this year, and this requires everyone to uniformly report their pension and OPEB funding across the state. So we did that in January, and then we'll have to do it again before the end of the year. January was the first time period that we had to report. And so far, we've been determined not to be underfunded. They have a standard. So we don't have a correction action plan needed. A lot of entities did, so I'm not sure what they're going to do with this in the future. A part of this act was to set the uniform reporting requirements. So, and what that does is say everyone has to use a certain rate of return, they have to use a certain amortization period, they have to use a certain mortality table to calculate their unfunded liabilities. So that right now, it's basically going to require us to do two actuarial reports. Because we don't use those assumptions, but I can see down the road that they're going to make everyone use the same assumptions. But so this is meant, I think, to make all entities report the same way so they can compare uniformly across the state. And it's not part of the act yet that we have to switch to that, but I foresee that coming in the future. So just something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, so Jeff, I have a question. Have you had a chance to look at the reports submitted by other cities? And I'm curious if other cities are funding their OPEB in the same way that we are.
Some are, some aren't. Most aren't. I would say we're above the curve on most OPEB. The state report that I looked at doesn't give the percent that they're contributing. It just gave if they were funded or unfunded on the giant database that they did for all via this act. So I'm trying to get additional data on how much people are actually contributing, which is not that I can find actually out there on the web yet. But we are touted as an example, though, typically across the state of doing things the right way. So
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious at what level other cities are funding. It's a significant amount of our annual budget, so.
yeah, some communities have chosen just to do pay-as-you-go because it's not required actually to pay any of the unfunded liability on retiree health care yet. Pension's a different story, but.
And do you have the data on long-term? I know we used to get kind of a 30-year outlook that showed as we completely convert to an HRSA when the OPEB liabilities will diminish and
We
then
do,
be
yeah. So
done?
each plan, and I'm actually having to rerun the numbers this year. I just talked to him yesterday about it. So each plan, they funded it to not run out of money basically in the trust. So each plan right now has a different amortization period. I think the general one is about a 14-year period, and I think police is 22, and I believe fire is 24. And what they did is trying to time the contributions with the outflows of cash. So, and we've done a long-term analysis too of when we invest, of when we need to move it from the long-term investment to a short-term to pay the ongoing costs without having to impact our pay-go costs. So as part of this report, I'm going to have them do two analyses. One, the way they've done it now, and another one to say, can we extend those timeframes out and not get unfunded at all, but to see what that would do to our annual contribution. So,
Okay.
yep.
Yeah, I remember when we moved to an HRSA, we spent a lot of time looking at, okay, you know, what is that bell curve? When will we start seeing a reduction in our contribution and liability?
I know
So
that-
it might just be nice to get an update on that.
I know the general fund, the general one I looked at, we went from, over the 14 years, so I think it was 2033, we went from 4.4 million a year to like $200,000. So it was a huge cliff drop off in 2033. But that's a long time to get to. So I'm trying to get them to look at.
None of us will be here.
Yeah.
But
Can we
the next mayor and commission will thank us.
we perhaps smooth that out a little bit without running out of cash? So that's what they're looking at.
And
this
if
year.
the reason why I asked my question earlier, if I remember correctly, the last one of these, we were at 300 million unfunded, and we're down to 285, so we've chipped $15 million
Little bit, yeah.
off of it, so.
Other questions, commissioners? All right.
Okay, healthcare. This is our trend report we get for healthcare with our estimated increases. You can see for 2019, they're projecting a 9.89% increase, and you can see it stays right around the 8 to 10% projected mark. The good news was they projected a 15% in last year's report increase this year, and it actually fell under 10. So we should see from what we budgeted a slight decrease in the healthcare contribution amounts this year. But and just a reminder, we are going to go to the tiered rates effective January 1 of 19. So if you're single, you'll see a huge drop in your paycheck contribution amount. But if you're two-person and family, you'll see an increase. And that was all bargained at the last set of bargaining. So good news, we have great, strong GOF reserves, as far as we can tell, the highest in history. We continue to see positive growth in our income taxes. For 18, our ongoing revenues exceeded our ongoing expenditures. The state has kicked in their share for Vital Streets, so that program's in really good shape. And again, the country has really experienced our longest economic expansion in history, which makes me a little nervous too, because it always has to come to an end. But the local economy is doing really, really well. You all know that. You see the building going on around here, and very low unemployment rates. And again, inflation remains in check. Concerning news, capital set aside always makes me a little worried that, we don't want to get too much debt in our capital in case we need to move some funds around. So we watch that closely, and obviously with the increased costs we're getting in our bids, it's requiring more capital investment. So we always have to make sure we're putting enough aside to maintain our assets. Here's your total on incurred on pension. So from 2002 to now, we're actually contributing about $39 million more than we were. So it's an extremely large portion of the budget. 23 million of that is general fund alone. So, and that's just with pension contributions and OPEB contributions.
So Jeff, the fact that a significant amount of that is general fund, is that because we have the two systems with moving to defined contribution versus the pension defined benefit?
Part of it's the pension. So police and fire is all general fund. So that whole pension contribution is part of that 23 million. Obviously, the general pension is split up. I think it's typically about 60% general, 40% other funds, and the same with the OPEB. So.
Okay. Thanks.
And you'll see in a minute when we project some wage increases, ongoing expenses quickly exceed our ongoing projected revenues. We still do use a little bit of one-time revenues, however, that's pretty much been phased out. And again, we can use our reserves for a bit because we're above our guidelines. However, you can see, most economists, again, are projecting a recession within 3 to 5 years. So this is income tax projection, revenue. This is the capital plan. So this shows how much limited capacity we have in the capital plan based upon the FY19 budget. If we keep our minimum $1 million reserve, you can see the red line at the bottom shows the capacity for additional items, or if income tax receipts should falter, those types of things. So we're very, very tight on our capital plan, and we do have a couple other bond or debt issues planned for FY 2022, and that's the MLK Lodge and Division Street Fire Station, and then street lighting bonds. This was a GOF outlook. So what we did is a few different scenarios here, and if you recall, we built the FY19 with a 1% wage increase for 3 years. And you can see the surplus or deficit, the red numbers are really what to key in on, and the scenarios are along the bottom. So scenario 1, we added a 1% wage increase with an annual, with a 1% lump sum payment. And you can see what it would do to the revised budget in 19, it would make it almost break even, excuse me. But you can see going out with the compounding effect on those raises, what it does to the surplus or the deficit, and obviously it's always a deficit here. Scenario number 2 is a 2% wage increase with a 1% lump sum. You can see in 2022 it's about 5.8 million at its peak, and then scenario 3 was just a straight 2%, and that amounts to about, at its worst, about a $5 billion operating deficit. And then scenario 4 is a 3%, and that's about 7.6 million. And then FY23 and 24 in these scenarios would have no wage increases projected. That's why those kind of fall flat in those out years. So we have some work to do to keep our employees well paid and keep attracting talent. So some of the strategies we can use, we're going to continue to use targets to help departments meet their goals to balance the general fund and other funds, obviously. Enhancing our revenue streams, income tax obviously is our biggest revenue source, so we continue to work on ways to increase our income tax. Senate Bill 1127 could potentially help. That's universal withholding. That would require all entities to collect local income taxes. Again, we talk about district court, state equity, or court reform. It's one of our larger subsidies. And then, again, transformation savings with shared services, process efficiencies, those types of things. And we really want to do more expansion with our health and wellness program to keep our healthcare costs down. I believe next steps, Mark, wanted to talk about?
Thank you, Jeff. I want to thank Jeff and his team for the work that they've done in providing this financial update and economic outlook. Didn't know Jeff was quite the economist in his view of our crystal ball. But I do think, as he mentioned, that there's a lot of work and opportunities for us to improve our financial outlook as we begin preparing the budget. And what I wanted to do was to create a bridge between today and the time in which the budget will be presented. Next week, we will have 2 important discussions. The first will be around our strategic planning for this organization, in which I will be asking the commission and inviting you to be part of the dialogue about our aspirational vision as a community, what kind of community do we want to be, and our priorities around that vision. Last year, my understanding is that there were 8 priorities that were identified, and we're going to be revisiting those to make sure that those are the priorities for fiscal year 20, as well as be providing some other insights on some areas I think that will help us move towards our aspirational vision. The other conversation that we'll be having next week will be in closed session around our bargaining strategy. Jeff shared some interesting information around cost, and a lot of the cost drivers for our budget, as he highlighted, was related to wages and benefits. And so we would like to have a little bit more dialogue next week around some of our assumptions as we begin preparing for the negotiations. After the strategic planning session, we're going to have a facilitator that will be helping us with that topic. We're going to take from that conversation next week as staff, our management team, and we will begin working on shaping your discussions and feedback into priorities. And I will be sending information about plans from other communities. I think we have benchmark strategic plans from City of Raleigh, City of Austin, and our very own GVSU. to look at and see how we might model a very condensed plan. I know that there's been a lot of planning that's been done here in the past with the transformational plan, sustainability plan, and work that has been done last year, but I think you'll appreciate having a more condensed and consolidated strategic plan. We will also have an opportunity to provide updates in January, February, and March on our progress regarding our planning efforts, and even in January, I envision we may have an opportunity to have a community update, one in person and one online. Our hope is to have a finalized plan in the month of March, and that will drive our budget decisions and will inform my recommendations to the commission on the FY20 budget, which I intend to deliver on April 23rd, and the commission will hopefully adopt by May 21st. So that is the roadmap of next steps, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right. Commissioners, any questions? I believe all of us have the session on the 4th on our schedules. Any questions for our city manager? Any questions for Jeff?
I just wanted to comment on how, I think it's on page 16, it's so great to see that, was it page 16? That we're at 57.79 good and fair with our Vital Streets plan. That is amazing, and I'm so happy that we got started early. Recall that we took out a loan to get it sped up, and I think it's paying off because at that point the interest rates were so low.
Yeah.
And our public is, of course, struggling driving around town, but also very pleased that we're getting a lot of this work done. So congratulations to Rick and to Eric and to all those who are working on the Vital Streets plan. It's great. And to Suzanne, everybody who was involved. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Although I have to say, I know we all still get complaints about our streets, and it's good, this is when it's good to look at data. I don't see Becky Jo back there, but it might be nice for us to get an update on the 311 data over the last 6 years. I know, I think it was last year I looked at it, and the number of complaints we got about potholes had been reduced, I think, by almost 50% over 4 years. So even though I still get lots of complaints about streets, as I know all of you do, I remind people that we're making progress, but it takes time. And that we've invested millions of dollars and done hundreds of miles of streets. But we have, 566 miles of streets throughout the city. So we have a ways to go. So, and I have to say, we should, one of us should, after today, take a picture and send our good friend and former colleague, Commissioner Schaefer, a note, because he was the strong voice around this table that really pushed for us to increase our reserves. So he was around this table with some of us as we lived through the economic downturn, and after that was the push, the driver, I should say, to really build up our reserves to make sure that we didn't have to go through that again when we, and if we go through an economic downturn. So
Great.
I'll turn to my first ward colleagues to make sure you send a thanks to him for that. All
Great.
right, anything else?
Thank you. I'd like to thank my budget staff for helping me out on this. Scott Sainin, Keith, and Molly did great work on this. So.
Yes, thank you. All right, thank you. So next, I'll turn to our second item, and this is an update on proposed zoning ordinance text amendments relative to the implementation of the Housing Now recommendations 3, 6, 8, and 9. And so I think I'll turn to our city manager to tee this up, and then he can turn it to Suzanne.
Thank you, Mayor. We've had several conversations around finalizing the recommendations around Housing Now, and had a chance to get feedback from large amount of community, from the community engagement process, and you've heard the categorizations of recommendations that we've had regarding those recommendations that we thought we could implement immediately, those that required a little bit more work, and those that we recommended deferring to the master plan. since then, I think what will help both the commission and community better appreciate the recommendations is the context, and we've not only looked at how we are trying to adopt these recommendations in this community, but there's comparative data that we've included from other communities across the country. And I think that will help to give some perspective on how progressive we are relative to our housing our housing developments. So with that, I will turn it over to Suzanne, and she's prepared some information for the commission to walk us through the recommendations.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. What you have before you are two sets. One, the printer printed larger paper than I had anticipated, but it makes it for a nice package. So the first is a table in front of you that shows the ordinance amendments that were proposed from the Housing Advisory Committee, current conditions, so other things to keep in mind with the zoning ordinance, and then proposed action moving forward that just is suggested from staff's perspective based on the input that we've had from the community, the WMCAT engagement, Housing Now compendium, and then also looking at other cities. So the cities that we looked at were Ann Arbor, Austin, Minneapolis, Portland, and Seattle. And staff took a look at similar provisions throughout, and in that analysis, tried to compare to what we have in Grand Rapids, and we can talk through those. The other piece that were provided to you is a colored document we called it a scorecard, just to illustrate, because I thought just looking at this black and white table with the comparison from other communities didn't fully tell the story about how we're regulating and how that's different than other communities. So I wanted to provide a more full picture. So that scorecard shows that we have 2 residential zone districts in the city, low-density residential and mixed-density residential, and that other communities have multiple zone districts and in many cases don't allow for the full range of residential dwelling types that we do in Grand Rapids. You may have seen or recall that I think we've provided it to you twice in the past, kind of a primer on housing types in Grand Rapids and how it relates to zoning. I can also provide that to you if you'd like more information on that, but I figured you'd already seen it before. So, but for example, in Ann Arbor, they have 5 zone districts that are single-family zone districts, and they don't allow for single-family attached duplex townhouse or multifamily at all in those zone districts. They do allow for accessory dwelling units. So that's just an example, but it shows what other cities and how they are evaluating it. We're closest right now to Portland, from the standpoint of allowing for a whole range of types within all zone districts. There are some exceptions to that. We use the special land use process by allowing all of those, which is the orange and shown on our table. So we still require that Planning Commission public hearing. Portland has, they, for example, allow, in fact, all of these communities, with the exception of Austin, allows ADUs by right with administrative approval. And then the others have either they just allow it or they don't. So there's kind of a different variation. So our nuance is that we allow it with a public hearing after the Planning Commission has reviewed it and they take that input from neighbors. So just wanted to provide that context too, because I think in looking at those communities, I wanted to make sure that that was reflected. So when we talk through the black and white table, which I'll do with the recommendations, is that when we talk about certain zone districts, so for example, on the first line about eliminating the lot area requirement of 20,000 square feet, you see the city of Austin, and it reflects, it says SF-3, so that's one zone district in Austin. So that was kind of the comparison. It gets pretty complicated, but I wanted to provide more context to you in talking about those other communities. And I don't know, as a commission, how much you want me to elaborate on the other communities, or other than if you have it in front of you, and you would prefer to focus on the Housing Now recommendations and whether those should move forward or not.
Mayor?
1B, yeah. Let's focus on housing now.
Okay, just focus on Housing Now, and then you've got that information if we want to delve deeper. Okay, so I won't, just for the sake of time, I didn't want to go into it if you didn't think it would be valuable. So the first recommendation from the Housing Advisory Committee was small-scale development. That was focusing on allowing for that missing middle housing type within Grand Rapids in the neighborhoods. We allow it, it's just kind of the method we do, and then also the requirements for it. So, for example, right now, we have a minimum lot area of 20,000 square feet. That's just below a half acre in size. We used to have variances granted for people to develop less than that. We switched it under Great Housing Strategies. When we passed Great Housing Strategies, we made it a provision that could be waivable by the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission has been granting those waivers. So it's really a provision that's antiquated. It's a carryover from our previous zoning ordinance before 2007. And really, after understanding it, seeing the variances, and now the waivers from the Planning Commission, it's really no longer needed. What really controls, and under the current conditions, you'll see that, are the density requirements. So we require so many, or allow so many units per acre, and that will control the density. So 2,000 square feet per unit in the traditional neighborhood would allow for 21 dwelling units per acre. In the mid-century neighborhood, 17 dwelling units per acre, and in the modern neighborhood, 15 dwelling units per acre. So that's what controls the density for it, not the lot area requirement. The recommendation is to advance this and to allow for this ordinance amendment to occur. The second one we've talked a lot about, I think, is reducing the minimum dwelling width from 18 feet to 14 feet. And the history on that is that 18 feet is the standard for a single wide trailer, and so trying to kind of change that after that long history and allowing for that 14-foot wide construction. Not a lot of opposition to that, particularly when you start to visualize what's the difference between an 18-foot versus 14-foot unit, and so that's suggested to advance. When we look at two-family dwellings with administrative approval on corner lots, currently, we require that the lot area be 130% of what it is in the single-family structures in that neighborhood. So we look at the block and the lots on that block, and it's 5 on either side, and look at that standard lot width, lot area. And then for a duplex, it has to be 130% above that. And it used to be 150%. During Great Housing Strategies, we lowered it to 130 with bonuses of additional reductions for accessibility and affordability. The recommendation, though, is to eliminate that and make it the same size as for single-family homes. So if you have the standard on the block for the lot area and lot width, then it would just be the same. That one, though, would allow for administrative approval, and because of that, the suggestion would be to move that to the master plan, because if it's the same and it's treated the same as a single family, we would be reviewing that under administrative rules. The final one under the Housing Advisory Committee recommendation for number 3 would be a multifamily approval administratively within 100 feet or 500 feet of a mixed-use commercial zone district. You recall that the Planning Department had proposed 100 feet and that the Planning Commission had proposed 500 feet. Right now, again, that use type is allowed in LDR, it's just the approval path. And that one has received the most discussion amongst the neighborhoods and concern, both from an equity standpoint as well as change and predictability. And so it's recommended that that move to the master plan.
Suzanne, I want to, since we're looking at this and not the full packet,
Yep.
I just want to be clear. So for 3 and 4, there's still a path to get approval, but it's special land use.
Correct.
Okay. I just want to make sure for anyone who's following along or wanting to track our conversation that that's really clear.
Right. We could do similar to what we did in the, in number 1, the example of the 20,000 square feet. Right now, where it is in the code is important. So, for example, we had that requirement of 20,000 square feet, and it wasn't waivable by the Planning Commission. So then you had to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So that was a hardship for development and made it more challenging. If you wanted to make it easier for two families, we could look at something that's more waivable for the Planning Commission, but it would still follow that process. Or if you wanted to allow administrative approval, then that would just be striking that.
Mayor?
Commissioner?
So talk to us a little bit about how that would play out in the master planning process. So my assumption is that then the different neighborhoods would all take a look at their area and decide where that makes sense. Correct? And then you would have that guideline to go ahead with administrative approval. When I look at some of these other comparisons and where they have, I'm wondering, have they already gone through a process like that in order to determine what can be administrative approval and what's not?
Some have. It depends on the level, if they have a form-based code and how detailed their form-based code is, which is really the direction that we're suggesting by saying design guidelines, that it is more, if it looks like this, then that's administrative approval. If they want to do something different, that might be fine too, but then it would maybe follow the path of a public hearing. So there are some distinctions that we can make moving forward in that regard.
Well, and I feel really good about the fact that we're well along that path in determining that we want different housing types, and we've already done a lot with form-based code. So we're close.
We are very close.
All right, thanks. I'll keep us going, and then we can come back and give feedback.
Talk through all of them, okay. The second Housing Advisory Committee recommendation, number 6, was for density bonus for affordable housing. Everyone has an affordable housing density bonus that we looked at. We strongly support it. The comments that we received during the WMCAT engagement and from other public comments was that people want more time to talk through it, that some groups didn't feel that it was aggressive enough, that we needed to do more. Some of the affordable housing providers thought that they wanted to make sure it really worked well for LIHTC. The proposed recommendations were tailored towards what the LIHTC requires today. So we're, again, close on this one, but the suggestion was that maybe there's a couple more meetings that could be had to refine it a little bit further. So it's suggested that it just take a little bit more work, and the anticipated timeline for that would come back in February or March to you, that we would have meetings, given that we have the holidays in December. We would meet in January, probably early February, and then start to compose something to come back to you with something else.
Suzanne, can you give us a sense of what that means, not aggressive enough? What are some people, how could we make it more aggressive? I'm just curious, what is the recommendation to make it more aggressive?
So you could allow for additional density. I mean, it depends on the increment of additional, what the bonus is for affordable housing. So how sweet do you want to make that pot? An example would be in our neighborhood business districts, we have a maximum building height of 4 stories. When we look at the density, you can only fit so many units within 4 stories. And what we've heard is if you allowed 5 stories, well, then we could fit those additional units into that building. So that would be an example of being more aggressive on how we do it.
Although I think that the people who are advocating for it are saying it's not aggressive enough, and that they want that number, that 60% AMI number, to go down. I mean, at least that's what I heard from folks. So I think that there's two
So
types of
that's-
aggressiveness.
There's a development viewpoint on how aggressive, how many units can you get for that bonus, and then there's the housing advocates are saying you need to require that it's even lower for AMI.
So that's some of the additional conversation. Commissioner O'Connor?
Well, yeah, and I think that's, I mean, I mentioned this in other contexts as it relates to benefits and to bonuses, is you have to tie that bonus to something that actually allows you to financially move the needle. And to Commissioner Repart's point, moving the needle down to 60% AMI, well, that's a laudable goal. How much benefit can we, from a land use perspective, provide that allows that project to then become economically feasible? I don't think there's a way to tie that together. Maybe I'm wrong, but to create a density bonus just to allow you to have X happen, like, you have to be able to make the economy of scale work on that, to the point that, it incentivizes you to make that contribution to affordable housing. And if you can't make that contribution to affordable housing because the economics still don't work, then it's a pointless bonus.
Correct.
So.
Well,
And
and the other
the- and the-
thing,
I'm sorry.
I know that we've talked about this in the past with a couple projects that have been built over the last couple of years. It really does make a difference, too, when you allow additional stories, but yet after 4, after 3, they're set back. And so the scale from the street is more aligned with the character of the neighborhood. And I think we have a lot of good examples of that as well.
Step backs are a great way, and that's something definitely that I'd love to explore. It's a great suggestion. You do max out really at 5 stories, because then you started to get into a different construction type. Because they can build a concrete podium and 4 stories of stick built, but once you get above that, then it becomes prohibitive from a cost standpoint.
All right.
Yeah, I just think it's a lot more complicated than it sounds, because we really do need to identify areas in the city if we want to eventually streamline this process, but that's going to take some time and conversations with all the neighborhoods once again. We've just run into that buzzsaw before, and I think about Michigan Street and what it looks like, and there isn't necessarily enough space always to provide that setback.
Well, and one thing we need to think about, and again, I'll get back to where we can get through these, is are there some things we can do, but then, and not technically pilot them, but try them, knowing that we're going to move forward with a master plan,
Yeah.
that they can be revisited during the master plan process. But it also gives us a chance to try a few things in the meantime.
What it looks like, yeah.
So, okay.
You
All
can
right, so accessory dwelling units.
Yep. Accessory.
Lots of, we've talked about ADUs for a long time now.
So there's 5 pieces to this one. Number 1 is eliminating the lot area requirement of 5,000 square feet. Again, right now for ADUs, density requirements don't apply. So we don't treat it like a dwelling unit in addition to the main house. So it's just saying you can have one underneath current requirements. If you look at across from the other jurisdictions, Minneapolis and Portland don't have a limitation on square feet for the lot size. Some of the others do. Ann Arbor's 5,000, Austin's 15, and Seattle's 4 if it's detached. So you kind of have a whole range of things. The second one is increased building height for accessory dwelling units to allow 2-story garages, or they call them Fonzie flats, which is fun. Right now, the current maximum for garage is 14 feet, so this would allow for the 2 stories. So both of those provisions were saying, that's not a significant impact, so that would advance. The third one is increased floor area ratio from 25 to 40% between the primary structure and ADU. The intent of that is to think of that ratio so that you're not approving duplexes, you're approving an ancillary unit to the primary dwelling unit. We currently have a maximum square footage of 850 that would remain. So whether or not you wanted to keep that provision or change that ratio, what we found is that on smaller homes, that 25 versus 40% was really impactful. And I know saying that you can only use a quarter of your house and it's a small house, that was causing problems. So we're saying change the ratio, but also keep the 850 square feet, which is pretty much in line with the other jurisdictions. The fourth one is permit with administrative approval. Currently, it is allowed in the MDR with administrative approval, but in the LDR, it would be it's special land use. In all other jurisdictions, it's treated with administrative approval. And the suggestion is to advance that. And then lastly, eliminate the maximum number of occupants and number of bedrooms. Currently, we allow 2 bedrooms and 2 occupants, suggesting that there's more work here. We do require 1 parking space for an accessory dwelling unit. Parking by far is the biggest issue that we've heard from neighborhoods around this. And so probably more discussion would be warranted. Again, in this case, you see it kind of varies between jurisdictions. So I think it's kind of local preference in that, and that would be one area that we would suggest that we take a bigger examination of. As a side note, we've received questions about short-term rentals and those being used. Currently in the requirements for accessory dwelling units, you cannot use these as short-term rentals. And then finally, the last Housing Advisory Committee recommendation, number 9, is for non-condo zero lot line. This is to allow for attached residential dwelling units on their own lot so that they don't have to be part of a condominium development. Similar to the first proposal to reduce minimum dwelling unit width from 18 to 14 feet, that's suggested to advance. eliminate the lot width and lot area requirements. There are considerations regarding the Land Division Act, Subdivision Control Act, and the Plat Act that we want to just double check on. Because, for example, the Land Division Act, you can't do more than 4 splits off a parent parcel before then you have to plat it. And so I think there's some concern there to make sure that it is implementable with some of those nuances. So some of those questions have come up. And then similar to the small-scale development, permitting up to 4 or 8 attached dwelling units with administrative approval within 100 feet or 500 feet adjacent to a mixed-use commercial zone district. This is suggested to move to the master plan.
All right. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay, so I'm going to open it up for commission discussion, and it's not that we're voting today, but it would be nice to give some direction about next steps. Before us, we have recommendations about what to advance, what needs more work, as well as what really should be in a master plan, as well as, I remember in the memo, some timelines. Did you put in the memo some timelines?
Yeah, I don't have that right in front of me. The plan, the thought is that if there's ones that should advance, staff is already prepared, because we actually had the agenda item prepared when you had your public hearing in March. With that, so with that direction, it's a minor kind of administrative thing to change, and we could bring it back on December 4th for your consideration of the ones that you want to advance. The ones that need additional work, we'd suggest we'd have meetings in January, February, and you'd see something no later than March.
Okay, so in the packet that was in the agenda, it's on packet page 63. Commissioners, at the very bottom, there are some possible dates. So anyway, just to bring your attention to that. City Manager, did you have something to add?
No.
No? Okay. All right, so let's open it up. I'll start with Commissioner Lanier.
Suzanne, so we've already provided some input on these options, and I'm curious to know, because I don't see, at least from the session that I was a part of, where that input is a part of the recommendations that you've outlined today. So do you mind kind of sharing the input that you've received from commissioners already, and where you are with researching some of that, or is it no longer being considered?
Well, I think the discussion with commissioners kind of, so for example, the number 1 on the small-scale development, the question was whether or not you eliminate the lot area or you reduce the lot area, and so that you still have a floor in addition to the density requirements. The exercise of looking at the multiple jurisdictions was to try to provide also a lens to look through on how that might compare. I did not include those specific recommendations from commissioners because with all of you as a body trying to debate, I didn't want to make a specific recommendation off of just a few commissioners' requests without having the full amendment in front of you, the proposed amendment as it was provided.
Thank you.
So I think 7,500 was one of the numbers that we had discussed. Did that get discussed with the others, and where are we with that?
There were other numbers.
I guess, let me just cut to the chase. I don't want to regurgitate everything that I shared already, but I can if I need to. So I'm just trying to figure out where we are with the input that's been received. City Manager, maybe that's a question for you then. Because, if we need to do that, then that's fine, but, I thought part of the discussion was to try and streamline our discussion here today. Because there are a number of things, so incentivizing affordability, noticing residents, having entrances to, I think on the duplex one on the corner lots, having entrances on 2 different streets. I mean, I can kind of keep going, but I'm just curious to know where are we.
You're right, Commissioner, we did discuss that. And I don't have an answer on specifically why different feedback is not represented in the context of the presentation here today.
Okay. Okay.
So, and not being a part of those conversations, were some of the items that commissioners asked about or gave feedback on, are some of those still details that would need to be worked through with the planning department or the planning commission? Or help me
I don't think anything needs to go back to the Planning Commission. As long as it follows within the noticing. Some of it, I think they were preferences of commissioners as to what you would like to see, and the conversations were varied among commissioners. So that's why it's not reflected in here, because I didn't want to presuppose.
Sure, okay, that makes sense.
So perhaps what we can do, why don't you just give some of the feedback that was provided when we visited one-on-one of other alternatives that are not reflected on the options for Commissioners Lanier's sake.
Well, I think part of the, I mean, again, it's not, they're not recommending something, so the alternative solutions around what you're kind of talking about as a design guideline standard, there's no reason to develop it if we're not recommending it to go forward. I think if you want to have it go forward, then.
But I think that was part of the discussion, is to recommend it go forward with these caveats. So
Right,
that's-
I'd love to make it go
I
forward.
know
but
you
the-
would, but I think that was part of the discussion, so yeah, it would be great to kind of hear.
Yeah. Or are there items that you all would like to see more work done on? I mean, to me, there's these three pots, right? Like, what are we comfortable advancing based on all of the feedback we've received, all of the community input, now that we have data from other cities looking at their practices? What do we say, we really need to do more work on this, like the density bonus, and what really is more appropriate for the master plan? I think that's where we need to give direction to Suzanne and the department so that they know next steps.
Well, I can.
So Commissioner Kelly?
Yeah, I'm happy to see these in front of us, and I think that you have pretty much hit the nail on the head in terms of where we're ready to move and where the community has told us they are and where we need to wait. The big issues for me are not the tools itself, because they're great tools. It's about neighborhood input on those tools. So I think that we're moving in the direction of things that we've heard, and one of the things that's loud and clear, and I know Commissioner Lanier doesn't want to get in on, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about details again, was that we do want design guidelines in place. And I think that has to happen, and we need to see that, those standards and design guidelines before we actually approve anything. So I'm curious how we would go about that process.
So if
And
you're
then
talking.
also enforcement, of course, I'll talk about that later, but.
If you're talking about design guidelines for accessory dwelling units, there are other communities that have templates that have been used. And so we can certainly, I'm all for borrowing from other communities. And so we could certainly borrow those templates from them and have a brief process with the neighborhoods to make sure that that's agreeable to them. Probably the biggest issue, especially for the two-story garages, is where they're located on the lot. And there's a lot of debate about that, because if we allow right now a garage to be set a foot off of the lot line.
Yeah.
And so neighbors would be concerned about how close that is. So that's one of those issues that we would take into consideration. But the rest of the design guidelines, I think it really is going to depend on where, and that's a more detailed discussion with the neighborhoods, because then you're also getting into types of neighborhoods that by our form-based code, traditional, mid-century, or modern, and what's appropriate in those neighborhood types would be a more in-depth discussion, especially if we're talking about allowing administrative approval for row houses or townhouses.
So we know we have to do that, what's your sense of timeline, or how long that would take?
So it depends if you want the design guidelines to be separate or part of the master plan. And so it could be part of the master plan process. We really need to refresh our zoning maps and the future land use map. So the zoning maps follow what it says in the future land use map. And the future land use map, we need more detail on it. We have pieces from area-specific plans telling us where people are okay with change and where they're not. We would then take that information as well as additional input from communities and define where those areas would be appropriate, and then the design guidelines to go with it. So the timeline, it really depends on the master plan process, or if you want that separate from, I think it should be part of the master plan process.
We'd probably have some good examples from those that you've already approved to start that conversation, I would think, and say, here are some areas that maybe we can pilot it, and we could get, even if we put a cap on it, while we're working toward that larger conversation?
You could, I think Belknap is probably the best example where we've had significant change in the neighborhood from single-family residential into multifamily with the row houses and small buildings for apartments. And that was defined in their area-specific plan of where those changes should occur and the expectations for design by the neighborhood. And they actually have their own design committee in the neighborhood where they've provided input into that process. For the zone changes, though, the nuance there is that we've used the planned redevelopment district process or rezoning process to approve those projects to make sure that they comply with what the neighborhood's looking at, because they don't have some sort of design template that says these types of projects, if they look like this, we're okay. So it's been an indicator, their plan has been an indicator of where change should occur and what kind of change, but not necessarily what it looks like or how it works. And so that's a kind of a different level that we would then have to get into.
Commissioner Parr, did you have a question?
Just a quick one.
Okay, go ahead.
On 3.3, this is a little nuanced thing, but it says eliminate lot area rule for 130%. But there's a bonus reduction if it's affordable. What does that get it down to? Do you know that offhand?
I can pull it right up here. You can get a reduction of 10% if units are priced at or below 30% of the area median income. The units are, or if the units are accessible, type B unit accessibility requirements according to the building code. So we give a reduction both for affordability and accessibility.
Okay. This is my favorite one. And I understand that we may need to move this to the master plan, but maybe right now we can extend that bonus down to 100% for if it's going to be an affordable housing developer. Is there a way that we can extend that bonus further?
Sure. Yeah,
this moment?
you could ratchet it down that, so the bonus, and we have actually a developer who just used this on the west side for the hall that's getting redeveloped on 4th Street.
Yeah.
And they actually are providing accessible units using this methodology for accessibility. So we are starting to see it used a little bit more. But we could, you could reduce it down to 110% and allow kind of reductions from there if you wanted to do that.
I would love to see that happen now. And then there's that guarantee of affordability, and then the rest of it can be sorted out in the master plan.
So Commissioner Moody, welcome. Good to have you. We're on item number 2, so we're discussing some of the recommendations. Suzanne, just follow up and get clarity on what Commissioner Kelly said. For the design guideline piece and input from the neighborhood, for our historic districts, HPC would still be involved, correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay. So Commissioner Linear, and then O'Connor, and then Jones.
So, Suzanne, so back to the design guidelines. So I think, as I'm looking at this, I don't think I'll be comfortable with making a decision on December 4th without the design guidelines for all of it. So, I don't know that I'm comfortable with making a decision about the size of an ADU or what it looks like or where it should be without the design guidelines in advance of that. I also know that you were talking about going back into the community, and we were recommending that when you go back into the community that some of those design guidelines, including pictures of what people would expect to see, would be appropriate. So I don't think that we should vote before we even go back to the community to kind of let them know what this all means, because at least I was hearing that we felt that was missing, that perhaps people needed to see what was being discussed when we talked about changing the size from 18 to 14 feet and things of that nature. So it didn't sound like your timeline was set in stone, so I don't know if there's room to not try to bring this back for a vote on the 4th, but to do some of the work that we had talked about and then bring it back maybe in January if you have the time to do that.
We could, I think the concern I have is kind of the tail of this and how long it is, and trying to have a decision so we can move forward with the master plan to open up all the other stuff to get it going. So the resources needed to do that work when we want to get the master plan going poses a challenge. So I think then if you can allow, if you already allow accessory dwelling units with special land use, how much of a barrier is that? Or do you approve all of the other changes to make it easier for accessory dwelling units, all the dimensional requirements, and not the approval process? Because really, I think what the hook with the design guidelines is the type of approval process you use.
Absolutely.
So that's the key to both. Those are the two things that are hinged. All the rest of it, all the other dimensional requirements are just numbers in some way, in some ways, and some of them are more aggressive than others, and that's where I think the piloting works, because then you have a sense of whether or not that was effective.
But I think you get me to a place of being supportive if the community is aware of what it is that I'm supporting.
Yeah.
And so without that, it's challenging to be in a position to say, yes, let's do away with special land use on an ADU and give away all rights for the public to be able to weigh in.
Yeah,
So
that's
one of
fair.
the recommendations that I made was, is there a possibility for us to have notices similar to the hens in the backyard and fire pits for noticing neighbors, so that it isn't as labor intensive as the notifications that they would get if it was going through a special land use and coming before the planning commission, et cetera, but it would still give neighborhoods the opportunity to weigh into what's the character of their neighborhood changing based on an ADU or anything else coming in it. So have we done any research on that to
Yes.
determine where we are with those?
Yeah, we can do an administrative hearing on it rather than planning commission, and allow for notification of neighbors. The challenge there is that where that threshold is, as far as how much discretion then, as the planning director, I would have to deny a project versus if it's in compliance in all other regards, it's going to be more difficult to deny it. The planning commission has, I think, more discretion for that, but it's definitely a possibility where the neighbors would get notified. We would conduct a hearing in the same way as the planning commission, but it would be less costly because we don't have it may not involve all the preparation, and odds are we are already working with that homeowner on what their approval would be, and then we would be familiar with it.
So the notifications for the chickens and the fire pits do not require an administrative hearing.
Correct.
So what's the status on whether something like this with ADUs could be similar to that? Where it's just kind of blanket yes or no based on the responses that you receive from neighbors?
So the distinction here is you're dealing with property rights and due process. So, for example, if there's a denial by the Planning Commission, there's due process to the Board of Zoning Appeals. In this case, you would have to establish that you've developed a process that's fair and impartial for the property rights to be considered and for that applicant to, if they have a dispute with their neighbor and the neighbor says you can't have those, but I'm entitled to that, something different, then we run into issues. So that's the challenge, and that's why it's different than fire and chickens, because you're not bestowing a property right into somebody to hold chickens.
Right.
Whereas you are with an accessory dwelling unit.
So Suzanne,
know if I see the distinction,
just
but
a
okay.
follow-up question on that, and then I'll get to Commissioner O'Connor and Jones. So let's say hypothetically, we decided until the master plan process was done to put in some short-term changes. And we did administrative approval for ADUs with notification to neighbors. If there was a denial, would the applicant have the ability to appeal that to the planning commission? And
It would be
heard by the full
appealable to
planning-
the
Or would
that-
it go to the BZA?
BZA.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So there still would be a process in
Yes.
place where if someone was denied, they could still have an appeal?
Correct.
And, okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So we can definitely write language and try it out. I mean, it's a good pilot, I think, to test and see how we can make it less burdensome with going to planning commission, still have that administrative review and neighbor notification. I think that's definitely something worth trying. And I'm not opposed to figuring that out at all.
Okay.
Mayor, I had two other points, and
Okay.
they're really quick. So the other with the ADUs was tied to how do we incentivize affordability? I don't see that kind of written here anywhere. And then the last was on how do we create a plan to incentivize development on 28th Street, Plainfield, and Lake Michigan Drive. And I know I've been saying that for over a year now, probably close to two.
You're not
And
saying Alpine anymore, though.
I'm not saying Alpine, because you corrected me on that, so L2P instead of A2P. So I'm just curious to know where we are with looking at that, because if our ultimate goal is to bring more housing, and we know where we have land where housing could be, especially in a dense format, I think the disruption of neighborhoods is the biggest concern for people who live in the community. So why aren't we taking a look in spaces where, you won't have as much disruption to neighborhoods?
So we just adopted a change within the past 6 months to the zoning ordinance to encourage more residential development in those corridors. They were already allowed, but we changed it to administrative approval so that there's no barrier from the approval side of it. I think it would be, how do we couple the changes? There's no barriers in my mind from a zoning perspective on why someone couldn't do residential there. I think it's how do you incentivize that? And so it'd be more, what are the economic development tools available through tax credits or other things to put a carrot out there. I think
Right.
from the zoning standpoint, we've done everything we could do to make, to eliminate any barriers. The question would just be, how do you incentivize it?
And so that would be good to kind of hear an update whenever, city manager, that there's been work done on that end, because I think we talked about economic development being kind of the spearhead of trying to come up with a package that is enticing to developers.
Yeah. So just to clarify, because I remember talking about this and I remember making the change to administrative approval. As of right now, in 28th Street, 44th, Plainfield, there could easily be a very high-density project planned and that process is already streamlined for approval.
Yes.
Because of how that's zoned. So it's really not planning and zoning. And then I know Kara's in the back. We're embarking on this economic development strategy, and I know that has been a conversation. So I see Kara shaking her head, so maybe we can just get an update on that, and I'll have the city manager work with you on that. Okay. Okay, so Commissioner O'Connor and then Commissioner Jones.
She didn't answer my question about affordability with the ADUs.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Go
incent
ahead, Joe.
affordability with ADUs.
I think from, to Ruth's question, and this came up this is what came up in the other discussions with commissioners, is how do you enforce that? Because to put a unit in someone's home and to try to enforce affordability is a strong concern, because I can't go and check their records, and once you've granted the right, they've got the right for that accessory dwelling unit. So I don't think it's feasible to do an affordability requirement for an ADU, just because I don't think there's any way that we could logistically enforce it.
And city manager wants to weigh in.
Not so much from zoning, but I think from potential other incentives from the Housing Trust Fund that we're establishing, maybe we talked to a couple of the commissioners, I recall, about incentivizing affordable ADUs from that standpoint. So not so much with the stick, but with the carrot.
And I'm making an assumption, and Suzanne, correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe Commissioner O'Connor will correct me. With ADUs, the likelihood of the square footage is going to directly impact affordability. I mean, these are not going to be huge units. I mean, ADUs typically, you look throughout the country, they tend to be smaller units that tend to be more affordable because of the size, similar to micro units or studio apartments. They're not going to be these big family units with 3 and 4 bedrooms, and so then they're going to be more affordable just because of the size.
Yes.
So we're saying 4 people can live in them on page.
Well,
So if you, that's my point.
If we could, well, right now, the needs more work is changing the
Right.
rule of 2 persons and 2 bedrooms.
Yeah.
So I think that keeps it small.
Yeah.
If we could walk through, I don't know, I mean, if you're up for this, but what I'd like to do is walk through each item briefly. I already gave you the overview. I think that based on the discussions we have had, that we're really close to being able to advance something, and I think that you've all had time to think through it and to know what you want to see. And I think having the benefit of the discussion for all of you to participate in that would be great. And I don't think, some of these I think are very easy to coast through.
Can I just get to Commissioner O'Connor's comments or questions and Commissioner Jones, and now that Commissioner Moody's here? So those are the only 3 that haven't had a chance to make any additional comments or ask questions, and then I agree. We'll walk through each one. We'll see if there's consensus around this table about what to move forward, what needs more work. If there are additional recommendations like commissioner reports, then we can talk about that at that point. But let me just give the commissioners who haven't had a chance to speak up an opportunity to do that first. Commissioner O'Connor?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the work on this and for bringing forth this recommendations. And, I think everyone knows where I'm at. I'd move all of this forward tomorrow if I could. But I'm fine kicking some of this to the master plan and just getting to some finality on this. Again, we keep talking about affordable housing and the need in our community, and the longer we talk about things that have an impact, potential to impact affordability, and don't implement it, the law, we're not helping the problem. So I just want to get to some finality on whatever decisions we can get to. My only, pushback on any of this would be around the non-condo zero lot line recommendation as it relates to the number of units. And I know you want to move that to the master plan, but I do see that as probably, at least in my opinion, the most viable opportunity to create units in our community. And you see, I think there's real world examples happening right now that cost more than they need to. And if you look at the work that Habitat's doing, they just built a beautiful 4-unit property on 4th Street, right across from the Basilica. They're currently building some beautiful units down on Clyde Park. They're 4-unit condo projects, and the requirement that they go through a special land use to do those, plus the requirement that they have to create a condominium project for 4 individual units. So that means each building has to have its own condo development, and then you're adding a monthly, so you have an upfront cost that decreases the affordability of those units, and then you add on the monthly cost of whatever the homeowners association fee plus the management of that said project. We're layering on affordability, and if we can do these as non-condo zero lot line. And so I understand as a form type, 8 units is, we don't have a lot of 8-unit examples in Grand Rapids of any type, of any just a building that contains 8 units. But we have a plethora of examples of properties that are 4 units, whether they're condos or apartment buildings. And so as a form type, 4 units is a fairly standard thing throughout all of our neighborhoods in Grand Rapids. And so my ask would be to my colleagues to allow the permitted non-condo zero lot line up to 4 units. Again, we're going to go into a master planning process, but let's allow this to happen for at least the interim period between now and when we go through that process to see what happens. And I don't think that we all know the development cycle is long, that even if we change this in January, nobody's breaking ground until the spring. You got a 12-month build cycle. You're not going to get that many, but let's allow this to happen in some minor capacity to really see what, where the holes are at in this, kind of almost like a lot of things we do as a pilot. And I think that would be I think it's something, again, we live in the boom and bust cycle of low-income housing tax credits. They're the most probable way in which we build affordability into our community. And so we have these amazing nonprofit developers in Grand Rapids who are held to the requirement that they put their eggs in a basket and hope they get funded twice a year for a couple of projects. And we have a great track record of success, but there's multiple nonprofits in every cycle that apply that don't get funded. And so the ability to create smaller projects that may be able to live outside of there's no guarantee that these are going to be affordable, but the setting a table and setting a framework that allows them the opportunity to try something that's different, that doesn't require a huge tax subsidy, is, I think, a risk that is worthwhile, that I think we as a community should embrace and should try to provide that, to set a framework to let them try. And again, we'll be going through a master planning process in a very short period of time. I'm confident of that, and So I would just ask that we allow up to 4, just as a form type, it already exists.
So you're saying breakout under none, condo zero lot line, breakout 4 versus 8 unit?
Yes, a
and-
permit
and
up to 4
separate
attached
them out.
dwellings.
Okay,
Yes.
so Commissioners, that's something to think about, and we'll come back to
And
that.
I know that there was this idea of 100, 500, 1,500 is what, I remember planning staff standing in a meeting saying, well, we were going to recommend 1,500, but we didn't. So I get a little frustrated in that, and, as we talk about the concentration of impact, just like we talk about with the marijuana stuff, is as we create a smaller pool, we begin to concentrate impact of events, right? So there's less things available, so more people go after the fewer properties. And so I can think of, again, in a residential standpoint, our entire residential fabric of our community, there are lots and lots of places, like water runs downhill. People build in the places that it is the easiest to build. And so if the idea that you were going to have to do something within 100 foot of a commercial corridor, like you're limiting the pool of properties and you're forcing people to make harder decisions, where if there are opportunities to build a 4-unit property that's more than 500 feet from or more than 100 feet from a commercial corridor, because it's an easy property, that's where they're going to gravitate to first. And as we look at again, the cost of land, the farther you move from a business district or from a downtown, typically the cheaper the land gets. And so I think we're not going to concentrate everything along. All of a sudden, people are going to be building a bunch of 4 units near business corridors. There's a chance to build them in a neighborhood. There's a chance to build them in a form that has the potential to match what already exists. So, if I have to live with a setback of 500 feet or within 500 feet of a mixed-use commercial district, that's fine. But I think that's actually creating more of a problem, and I think lessens the pool of potential properties and increases the potential negative impact if there's any.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So Commissioner Jones, and then Moody, and then we'll go through each one and see if I can find some consensus.
Yep.
To move some things forward. Okay.
Thank you,
Commissioner
Mayor.
Jones?
Thank you, Suzanne. I just want to speak briefly on the design guidelines issue. I think that one way that we could move forward is, and perhaps it could be seen as somewhat of a compromise, and that is I would highly recommend that we glean from existing design guidelines and other communities throughout the country as a means of at least having something on the books that we can work from, with the understanding that it's going to get more attention and perhaps the attention that it rightly deserves during the master planning process. I just don't think that should necessarily be the impediment for us moving forward with ADUs. However, I am very, very sensitive to and can empathize with the neighborhoods and not wanting just any old thing being built in my neighborhood, but to have some restrictions, to have some guidelines, something that will not take away from the character of the existing neighborhood. And so I would highly recommend that we pull from, because I think even when we get to the master planning process, we're going to, I'd be really surprised if we had, more substantive discussions that would produce outcomes that are different than what we are seeing with some of the examples of existing communities. I think that there's something to be said about tapping into the wisdom that's already been put in place in other communities. And I think a good start, if you haven't thought about this already, would be the comparison cities that you have listed and to see what they're doing along the lines of design guidelines.
Yep.
So that's it.
Thank you.
Mayor.
Good,
Yep.
good input. Commissioner Moody, any questions before we move forward?
Yeah, Suzanne, thank you for this report. I had a chance to look at it. I concur with both Jones and O'Connor, but my number one concern is when we talk about affordability,
Yes.
I really need to know what does that look like within our community, within our city. Because everybody talks about affordable housing, but we have different communities with different incomes. So what is affordable housing to them? For me, that's very important.
It's an excellent question. And that's actually one of those, this is all so complex. And as an example, where on South Division, as we're doing their area-specific plan, we actually have tasked consultants with figuring that out, that AMI is one thing, but what do the people who live here, what can they afford, and how do we make sure they stay based on that knowledge? So it's kind of looking at a different side of the ledger when you're thinking about affordable housing. And so we are working on that question through that. I think we will learn a lot that hasn't been part of this exercise. When we look at affordable housing and how it's affected, if you look at the totality of these recommendations, certainly the biggest one that directly affects affordability is the housing bonus. Other techniques, though, for example, the inclusion of accessory dwelling units is a strategy because of the small scale size of them, that all these other communities, for example, with the administrative approval, found that that was one strategy without significantly changing the character of a neighborhood, that all the homes still stood. It's just that you're slipping in a smaller unit. And so that provides additional affordability. And then and then supply. And a lot of these recommendations address supply with the hope that then people are moving into other units and making more affordable units affordable for those, or available for those who need them.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's go through each one, see if we can find some consensus about what to advance, what needs more work, if we want to make some additional changes, and what really is most appropriate for the master plan. So Commissioners, again, the first section around small-scale development, the goal of this was to provide opportunity for infill, smaller scale houses and units, looking at some lots that currently are not buildable and can they become buildable. So the background on this section is really how do we create kind of smaller scale infill development. So Suzanne, do you want to walk us through?
Yeah,
And then I'll try to call the question and give some direction.
Perfect. So the first one is eliminate the lot area of 20,000 square feet. So among some of the commissioners, the discussion had been whether or not just to simply reduce that number to 5,000 or 7,500, or just completely eliminate it. Again, knowing that the density requirements do control for those lot sizes. You still have lot size requirements in that zone district based on the housing type, but just not this minimum.
Okay, so Commissioners, thoughts on this? It's pretty straightforward. It's
Yes, I have a question. When you talk about density, I think, if I'm correct, I think I heard my colleague, Commissioner Lanier, mention a few moments ago about the size of a particular home and the number of people that can go into those homes.
Yes.
In most cases, I want us to keep in mind that some families are larger than 4 and 5 people. And I think that needs to take into consideration. Once again, that comes back to what's affordable as well. But size, I'm not sure if we're going to be talking about the size of the neighborhood in terms of what their other homes are, in terms of their density and what they look like. I think that's very important to consider.
Thank you. So persons per unit, we look at no more than 4 unrelated, but if it's a family, the building code applies, and that sets health and safety standards. So it wouldn't apply to families. When we look at our other residential districts, it's based off lot area, lot width of existing neighborhoods. So we don't have an arbitrary number. We actually look at what's currently there.
That's good. I just want to keep in mind that even though those rules do apply, families take care of families.
Yes.
So if you've got a family that's homeless, another family is going to invite their family members in. So you can have more than 20 people living in a particular home.
All right, any other questions about this? So Commissioners, are we comfortable moving this forward? Okay,
I was more comfortable with the 7,500.
then eliminating it outright? Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else concerned? I want to kind of get a consensus of the group. If you're comfortable moving this and advancing this forward, which it would come back to us for final approval.
Correct.
Then I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. I think that's probably easiest for me. Okay, so there's support for that. So next, reducing the minimum dwelling unit width. We've talked about this at length as well. This would reduce it from 18 feet to 14 feet. Is there consensus to move that forward? Raise your hand. Okay. Suzanne, I'm just going to start
Yep, that's
busting through these.
No, I'm good.
So 2-family dwellings with administrative approval on corner lots, the recommendation is to move this to the master plan. Again, as Susan said earlier, Changes were already made after Great Housing Strategies, where it was reduced from 150 down to 130, so we already have made some adjustments to this. Are all of us comfortable moving this to the master planning process?
Or
Yes,
Commissioner
yes.
Repper has suggested reducing it from 130 down to 110 or 120 so that they're,
Making the bonus bigger for affordability,
oh, we could do that.
20% bonus instead of a 10% or
I think that's a great
a
suggestion.
30% bonus.
Okay, so this, we're having a recommended amendment. So why don't, Suzanne, can you explain that to all of us and if there's support for that? Again, all of these items will be talked about in the master planning update process anyway. So I want everyone to remember that. We're going to do some short-term changes, advancements, and knowing that they can be revisited during the master plan for additional clarity or amendments based on that process. So Suzanne, explain to us what Commissioner Repart is recommending and if we want to advance that.
So right now, we have the 130% larger than the single-family lots that are there. But we do provide a 10% reduction if it's affordable and 10% reduction if it's accessible. So his suggestion is to increase that percentage to make that more attractive, to hopefully get more affordable and accessible units.
Okay, I'm supportive of that. Commissioner?
Mayor, I think that this one probably could be put under more work, because some of the discussions that we've had included design guidelines. It also included where the entrances of parking would be, and some other elements more than just what Commissioner Repart, which I think is a good suggestion, has mentioned. And so I'd like for all of our input to be taken into consideration and more work to be done on behalf of staff, and then something else could be brought forward.
Okay, I think that's a good compromise. So can we move this from master plan to the more work column?
Yes.
Yes, raise your hand, yes. Okay, good, moving forward. Multifamily with administrative approval within 100 or 500 feet of mixed-use commercial zone district. This is recommended for master plan. Is there support for that?
Yes.
Yes, raise your hand. Okay, good. All right, affordable housing density bonus. Recommendation is more work. And again, this could take into consideration some of the feedback, both with the density bonus, but also with the AMI. Is there support to give direction to do more work and bring this back first quarter of next year? Yes. Okay. All right, next is the ADUs. Again, these aren't necessarily related to the approval process, it's just the overall recommendation. So the first one is eliminate lot area requirement of 5,000 square feet. Yes? Okay, I didn't see all hands. Raise your hand if you are yes. 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. You'll help me count. Thank you. Thank you. Increasing the building height for accessory structures with an ADU and allow 2-story garages. Yes? Okay. Next will be increase floor area ratio from 25 to 40% of the primary structure. Raise your hand if you're yes. Good. Okay, next is the permit with administrative approval.
So on that one, if I could just comment to Commissioner Lanier's point, what we could do is administrative approval. One thing to keep in mind is that, so there's, I guess I would offer 2 variations. One is we could do the postcard notification if we're doing administrative approval to the neighbors. It is at my discretion whether or not something can go to Planning Commission. We do have provisions in there. And so if there's neighbors' objections, we could send it to the Planning Commission. And then just follow that process instead. There may be an implication on the fee structure, so I think you would want to keep the fee low if they had to go to Planning Commission. So then we would come back when we did the budget for the fees to reflect the administrative process rather than the Planning Commission process. And then the question would be whether or not there's an increase in having them go through the Planning Commission process. So we could kind of hit a medium in there.
Which would address the concerns I've heard from a couple of you about neighbor notification and neighborhood input. I'm comfortable with that compromise. I think that notification with the opportunity to go to planning is a good compromise. And again, that could also be tied into future design guidelines.
I think so, Suzanne. I think that does meet, what I had shared before. I think what's still missing for me with ADUs is the design guidelines. And so, again, I'm saying no to advancing these because it's too unknown for me. And so before December 4th, I think that's important to have. Otherwise, you know, I think anyone who's saying that they're supportive of community voice shouldn't be supportive of anything like this being approved.
So Suzanne, is there, I'm curious if there is a process with the notification that there would be a design of what that ADU would look like that would provide for input, while we also look at, as Commissioner Jones said, there's lots of examples throughout the country around ADUs and design guidelines specifically for ADUs. Would that be a part of the approval process, and neighbors would be able to weigh in after seeing what that design looked like? And if it, I mean, you're already looking at, does it fit with the character of the neighborhood?
Yeah. I think and we do have rules already for accessory dwelling units about roof pitch and other things to make sure they're similar, but it's just the scale is different.
Right.
You may have no change from the outside. If they're putting a unit in the basement, for example,
Right.
there may be no physical modification at all.
Right,
Yeah.
right, okay. So let me see if I can get consensus with this.
So-
Commissioner Kelly and then Repart.
Yeah, I did want to comment too on the whole affordability piece. If you look at ARP's website, they are certainly saying, well, I'll say, for an older person with the declining incomes and growing housing affordability challenges, renting out a unit or moving with a friend or relative into their property can help with those costs. So I do think we are going to see some benefits around affordability because of the smaller size and especially now that we are having this huge demographic change with seniors. I think we need to move forward with this. But I am concerned, as is Commissioner Lanier, with those design guidelines, very much. So I don't know if we put a cap on this, but there has to be some way for neighbors to be able to talk about the design of the outside.
Oh, more work.
What it's going to look like, too. I know you've even talked about that. We listened to your planning commission discussions about you don't want people, buying windows from Home Depot and just slapping anything up, so.
So what I'm hearing is this needs more work.
Yeah.
So can we move it from advanced to more work and have it come back in January? Is everyone comfortable with that?
January's good.
Okay.
That'll give her more time.
Because I think under the more work, you said that you would come back in January. So are we good with that?
So just so that I'm clear, so it's one line under recommendation number 9. I think number 9 in its entirety needs more work.
Number 9 or 8?
Permit
The recommendation number 9.
Oh,
So
okay.
that,
permit with administrative approval.
yeah, so it's the whole number 9 housing now recommendation is what I'm saying needs more work.
So yep, so under number 9, that's the administrative approval piece. So we're gonna,
No, so the recommendation is number 9. So remember, all of the recommendations
oh,
had a
I'm
number.
looking at this
Yeah.
number 9.
So, yeah, so
So mine.
that recommendation in itself, we're reviewing 4 recommendations. This particular one is, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. It's number 8.
Okay, good. Now
So
I-
number 8, in its entirety, I believe, needs more work because the piece about the design guidelines isn't really just about one of the lines underneath number 8.
For
I think-
ADUs?
Yeah, for
Specifically
ADUs.
around ADUs?
Yeah.
I don't,
No, because some of the requirements around ADUs are separate from the design guidelines.
correct.
Yeah, but I think, I guess, okay, forget it. I'm too tired of saying the same stuff. I'm
Okay.
just done.
But can we get consensus that the permit with administrative approval, move that to a little bit more work and have that come back in January, with Suzanne taking into consideration notification and the concerns?
It's either you approve with administrative or you don't, like, it's pretty black and white.
Well, no, Commissioner, I think where we'd like more information is what does that process look like and the notification of the neighbors and when it will be moved to Planning Commission. I think just having more information.
Approval doesn't need to go to planning.
No, but Suzanne was saying that a middle ground could be that administrative approval with notification of neighbors, and then if there are concerns by neighbors, then it could be under the director's discretion, move to Planning Commission instead of administrative. So the planning director would have that ability that if there's concerns raised by the neighbor after notification, that could be reviewed by the planning commission.
Correct. Yes.
Capturing what you
Yep,
said?
yep.
Okay, so why don't we have that come back to us in January then, after,
Yeah, that's not a long.
yeah, it's
period
not,
of
it's
time,
not
but it
that
gives you
long.
more
I mean,
time.
it's.
Yeah,
6 weeks
that
from
one's
now.
not particularly difficult. I mean, we
Okay.
can, we'll look at, we've already identified design templates as well, so we could bring back examples.
And then that could address some of the concerns we have about design guidelines.
Yep.
So then the fifth one, eliminate maximum occupancy. This is recommended for more work. Do we all agree that it needs more work?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Again, this is, we're trying to get a sense of the consensus around this table. Okay, so next is under non-condo zero lot line, reducing the minimum dwelling unit from 18 to 14 feet. This is similar to the other one. Is there support for that? Yes, 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 okay. Number 2, eliminating the lot width and lot area requirements. The recommendation for this is more work, largely because there needs to be some analysis of the Land Division Act, Subdivision Control Act, and Plat Act.
To Commissioner O'Connor's point, though, 4 is kind of like the Goldilocks number, in that if you have a parent parcel, if you divide no more than 4 times, you don't run into some of those other issues, which is what the 8 started to get us into. So we can avoid some of those if you stuck to the 4 number. The question would be also on alleys.
We're on 2.
Yep.
Are you talking about 2?
She's saying that after 4 triggers the requirement to need that extra analysis.
Okay.
Yep.
That's a good point.
So if we move the third one forward, then the second one would go with it.
Correct. That helps.
Okay, okay, thank you. So for number 3, this is one where Commissioner O'Connor is saying break out and have permit for 8 attached dwelling units, go to the master plan
Yep.
process, but pull out the 4 units and move that forward.
Correct.
So, Mayor, I want to comment on that. There's, as Commissioner O'Connor said, and I quote him, there's no guarantee that these will be affordable. And I just don't want to forget the fact that this all started, this whole conversation started about affordable housing. And I appreciate the comments you're making today, Commissioner Reppert, about, finding other ways to do that with these other choices that we're making. I agree that we don't necessarily need to limit this to 100 or 500 feet either. It could be throughout the whole city because we want scattered site. But there are things that have to fall into place. We have to keep working with MISHDA to have those tax credits change so that we can have scattered site throughout the city. I think that we've talked all along that we can waive the fees for our low-income housing providers. I think they're the ones that are going to do affordable housing. So I think we can find ways to both use the carrot instead of the stick, again, to provide some support through our housing fund for these 4 units. But I keep coming back to the plan in the first ward, the Roosevelt Park neighbors who intentionally zoned to protect themselves from losing what's currently affordable to replace it with even a 4-unit that could price people right out of the neighborhood. So that's my reason for wanting to wait on that.
Okay, but we should clarify, 4-unit and 8 units, there's not MISHDA, those aren't eligible for MISHDA
Right.
Correct.
But we're
support.
talking about having.
They don't meet the threshold of the number of units. So I just want to be really clear that that's not currently under the law, that's not available.
No, so we'd have to incentivize here
Right,
in the
so
city.
I just,
But we can continue to work with MISHDA to talk about that.
sure.
I've
Yeah.
got
Should be.
Got
Yeah,
a
the
quick
QA.
question. Yeah, Suzanne, to what degree do we have, I guess, the authority or the power to, with regards to administrative approval, to somehow, for lack of a better term, control the type of housing unit that's created? Again, speaking to it from the perspective of a 4-unit, to my colleague's point, Commissioner Kelly, I know that we cannot make it to where it is affordable, but I think the concern is the potential of having some older homes that are demolished, that are then replaced by the 4 units. And again, thus making it perhaps not the most affordable. I also know that We have those within the nonprofit housing arena who would like to see the 4-unit because it's perhaps something that they can build without the support of a tax credit.
Yep.
And just wondering, what type of control we would have because, that there is that legitimate concern of neighborhoods being turned upside down because all of a sudden there's a number of homes that are demolished and replaced by the 4 units. And I say all that, the caveat to all of this is to the point that was made by Commissioner O'Connor, and that is if it is framed as a pilot program, something that we're taking a look at between now and the master planning process. That's a different conversation because I think that should be strongly considered. I think if it's framed as a pilot.
I think probably if you wanted to pilot it, what I would recommend is that you allow it for vacant lots that have alleys. Because that's the easiest way to build these, because you don't have drives and other things to worry about. That's one thing that, as we've been working with the land bank, that it's been more problematic when they don't have alleys to access these back units. And that's something that we've been wanting to delve into more. But if it's on vacant lots, and so if the trigger is if you're doing a demolition, you have to go to Planning Commission, that could be the compromise, is that if it's a demolition, then you go to Planning Commission. If it's on a vacant lot, you can build it. You're still subject to side yard setbacks. And so that still provides a buffer for adjacent neighbors. We do have vacant lots where we have multiples in a row that you could do something like this. And I don't think it would be highly problematic. The other question, just to add it to be a little bit more complicated, would be conversions. And so if we said only on vacant lots, that also helps remedy the conversion discussion for a while.
So if I can weigh in, and I love the idea of the abandoned lots with the alleys, but I'm still worried even about demo going to the Planning Commission just because of the trends we're having in the market.
You already have that now. You can
Okay,
already build
all right.
these now in any of on any of our zone districts. And so if they're going to do demolition, they're already going to Planning Commission.
Right.
So, and I know that Economic Development Project Team is looking at some solutions around demolition too, which are, that's a challenging
displacement.
conversation, but in
Suzanne?
displacement, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, explain to me I thought we talked about that, though. I thought there was not a way to, are we using the trigger of demolition as so it's allowed in the zone district, but the trigger is the demolition still has to, so it's still allowed anywhere in the zone district?
If it's a vacant lot.
No,
Right now.
well,
It's allowed, so right now, it's already allowed as a special land use.
Right.
Okay? So you're holding that, and then the exception is, but if it's on a vacant lot, then we can address it administratively.
So you're creating two-tier to try to incent development on vacant lots with alley access and allow this type of unit to be built. But if it's demolition, the process would stay the same because it would still have to go to Planning Commission anyway.
That sounds
I'm good with that.
I think that, Commissioner Park?
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that a couple of other things, I'm in favor of it being allowed all over the city if we're going to do that direction. I think in addition to vacant lots, maybe, and I don't know how you word this, but if the house is vacant, or if it's on the blight list, that there's nobody living there, there's no displacement that's happening. So that's maybe another thing that I see as a possibility. And then I also think that if we can waive fees, use the Affordable Housing Fund for that, for affordable housing projects, let's do that. Let's just throw that in there as well, to just make it that much more attractive for an affordable housing developer to take advantage of it.
So the fees piece would be during the omnibus, or however you want to address fees during your budget process, because it also affects your city commission policy on full cost recovery.
But let me, I want to
That's it.
make sure there's clarity because I want to make sure people are not confused. So when it comes to the housing fund, we have a board that we have appointed, and we're doing that in partnership with the Housing Commission. So we have to be really careful around this table because ultimately, we have empowered other people to weigh in, and we're in the process of creating an advisory committee that we need to really listen to as we look at how those funds are expended. And so I want to be really mindful of that we have lots of ideas, but we have put in a process to make formal recommendations on how those funds are being used, and there could be some very innovative, creative ideas that come out of that we need to consider. So I just want to make sure we're all really clear about that, and that there's not confusion. And then secondly, I'm hearing a compromise here, where we can move forward with administrative approval on vacant lots for 4 units, continue to keep any demolitions having to go through the planning commission, but then also include the 8 units in the larger master planning process. So does that capture a good compromise that I think addresses a number of the questions and concerns I've heard? Okay. Is that clear?
That's clear.
Okay.
One more thing. So this would apply in the 100-foot or the 500-foot. It cannot apply to the entire zone district because that's not what the public notification was for, and so it would open it up greater. So it has to be within 100 or 500 feet of a mixed-use commercial zone district unless you want it to go back through the whole process.
No, I mean, I think that's fair, and I think we heard early on a lot of feedback about that, about wanting to continue to have this transition from the corridor into low-density residential. Again, I think that can be revisited during the master planning process, but I think for the short term, when it comes to a pilot and opening up the door, especially on some of these vacant properties that have sat vacant for a very long time, this could be a really good interim, and we can see.
I mean, it has to be 500. 100 does not provide enough
Yeah, I think.
opportunities, nor just, again, it's another pointless, it's a change for the
Yeah.
sake of change that doesn't do anything.
I'm supportive with the vacant lot alley administrative approval, the 500 feet.
Okay.
Everyone else good with that?
Yeah.
Head shaking, yes.
Great.
Okay. All right, so Commissioners, I'm going to wrap this up because we have 3 action items still to get to before we go into executive session. We have, the plan then will be for the items that we asked to advance, for that to come back to us in December. We have 2 meetings in December, so if there's more work to be done, we can have that come back at December 18th if we like. And then the items that we said needed more work, we can expect those to come back in January. And then the items that we said need to move forward with the master plan. What I would like to recommend is that we have the city manager work with our planning director to come up with a couple options for us to look at, both for timeline and scope and cost for master planning process. I know I've said this to some of you, with the master plan update, we are not starting from zero. We have a master plan where I believe elements of it are still very relevant today, just as they were when it was adopted originally. Since then, we have a GR Forward plan that's been adopted. We have a Parks and Rec master plan update that has been adopted. We have several ASPs that have been adopted. And I think as we look at, we have the age-friendly work that's being done right now that will inform the update of the master plan. So we're not starting from zero. I think if we are really clear about the scope and the areas that we need to focus on, I think we can be thoughtful about a process, make sure it includes a significant community engagement, but I also think that we can get moving on it sooner rather than later. That's my opinion. I know some of you, we've talked about this, so what I would like to do is have the city manager follow up with Suzanne about that, and at one of our meetings in December, come back and we can talk about a plan for that. Are we good with that? Okay. All right. City manager.
Yep. Thank you, Mayor and Commission, for your feedback. I want to thank the staff, Suzanne and her team, for the work on that. And let me also add, when we come back in December and in January, particularly on those items that required more work or for the master plan, I will make sure that those items that required more work reflect some of the feedback that we had off dais by various commissioners as we continue to work on those. So that should be reflected in future briefings.
Great, thank you. All right, Commissioners, I'm going to move us along to item number 3, a resolution amending City Commission Policy 4001-01 under Investment Policies, Procedures, and Objectives. And this was brought forward to us earlier, but it's coming back largely to just correct some administrative errors.
So moved.
Support.
All right, thank you. John, you want to, our City Treasurer, you want to fill us in on anything?
Just quickly, Mayor and Commissioners, this is a living, breathing document. We will come back from time to time to ask for changes. The 3 changes we're asking for basically are, one is just a terminology change that is in the industry, moving from weighted average final maturity to weighted average life. The second item, we had a contradiction in our policy. State law allows us to go after and invest in government-sponsored securities. We had another section when we created the policy 3 years ago that prohibited us from doing that right away. So what we want to do is we want to pull out the prohibited section so we can then invest in those items. Those government-sponsored securities are like Ginnie Mae's and Small Business Administration groups of loans. And so that allows us to actually have a lot more flexibility and capture a little bit additional yield. The third item is then to change the percentage that we're allowed to move in that type of security. Our investment managers, as we've spoken to them, have said we have the potential of doing some greater work in that area. So we wanted to make sure that they had the flexibility to also invest up to a certain percentage of our portfolio. So those are the 3 changes that we're requesting today.
Great, thank you. All right, Commissioners, any questions about that? All right, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? It carries.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you, John. Next, that will take us to a resolution adopting the Records Management and Archive Service Fee.
So moved.
Support.
All right, City Clerk, you want to tell us about this?
Sure, I'm going to actually ask Tony Rake, our,
Oh, great.
to come up and kind of give the overview on this.
Hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you. So it was probably January of 2015, we added high-density mobile shelving to the city archives. That gave us an additional 3,800 to 6,000 cubic feet of space. It by no means has any kind of impact on future records brought in by City of Grand Rapids departments. So with the available space, we have decided over the past few years to allow local governments to use that space. And what they can do is use one of 3 options, an archives option, a records management option, or a blended option. Those have different fees that can be collected on a monthly basis. And with the current space of probably 3,800 square feet to about 4,000 square feet, we can bring in anywhere from as little as $57,000 a year to probably anywhere between $103,000 and $108,000 a year. So we have the space, we have the availability, staff can definitely handle the additional request. So we've even reached out to local government offices here in Kent County, and there is a great deal of interest. So depending on how quickly we move with other governments, I'm thinking probably within a year, we could probably add 100 to 500 cubic feet of records, and just continue that pace over the next maybe 5 years.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Is this your first time before us? I think so.
No, Darlene introduced me probably,
No, I mean to present an item.
present an item? I believe so.
Yeah, well, welcome.
Oh,
It's good
thank
to see
you. Thank you.
All right, so Commissioners, any questions about this?
I just want to
Commissioner?
say that this is one more example. We've had this conversation many times about collaborating and consolidating with our neighboring communities, so this is great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for your work
Yeah,
on this.
one other thing to know, and Tony put this in a note to me, that when the bond is done on the CARC, then we can go to outside, we can go outside the county too then.
Oh.
So that will open it up as well, so.
Wow.
so whenever
And
that-
when is that? When is that bond up?
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's probably 2020 to 2021.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Great. All right, thank you. All right, any other questions? All right, I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, it carries. All right, last item is our resolution authorizing the archives officer to execute records management and archive service agreements. So this is I'd say a parallel resolution with
Yes.
with your prior request. Anything to add?
No, just that the fees represent what is pretty common within the industry as far as records management and archive solutions. We used information from companies across the United States to develop 3 tiers of financing for these departments. They meet what we do currently for City of Grand Rapids offices, and it offers a little bit of a reduced service as you look through the fees. So it won't have a negative impact on us as far as the amount of work that we provide to the city. We're currently doing work with the Grand Rapids Public Schools and the City of Kentwood to store their records. And so we've had a great relationship with both for the past couple of years.
Great.
I'll make the motion.
Support.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. All right, Commissioners, I am going to ask for a motion to move into executive session. We actually have 4 executive sessions.
So moved.
Support.
All right, this is a voice call. Commissioner Park?
Yes.
Moody?
Yes.
Kelly?
Yes.
Lanier? Yes. O'Connor?
Yes.
And Jones?
Yeah.
And yes for me. All right, Commissioners, please get some coffee, use the restroom, and meet us down in the 6th floor City Attorney's office. All right, thank you.